É não chegar, senão a gente consigo. Ok, olá, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Este primeiro seminário, Seminário de Estudos pós-graduados, portanto inserido no programa de doutoramento de Política comparado. Estamos num contexto especial, portanto, eu agradeço de facto a colaboração de todos, não é possível termos toda a gente aqui presencialmente, até porque alguns dos nossos doutorandos estão, infelizmente ainda não conseguiram viajar para Portugal. Olá, Karin, por favor. E portanto, esta é a nova realidade. Portanto, nós, os seminários, vamos sempre ter este regime misto, pessoas que estão à distância, por várias razões, não vão estar cá, ou ter razões de saúde próprias, e portanto, vamos sempre recorrer a esta plataforma para termos esses alunos também presentes no seminário. Nós começamos, enfim, este é o primeiro de uma série de seminários, é o primeiro do ano e temos a felicidade de ter connosco uma distinta figura da ciência política europeia, que eu já passarei a apresentar, mas antes disso, porque também é o primeiro seminário desta série, estamos no início do ano letivo e temos a nossa diretora também aqui connosco. Eu pedi à Karin se podia dar umas palavrinhas de boas-vindas a todos os que nos estão a acompanhar em casa e quem chegou agora de fresco ao ICS.
Ok, muito obrigada. Boa tarde a todos. Se calhar vou falar em inglês para o Yves perceber.
Yes.
Yeah. So on behalf of ICS, I would like to welcome you all to today's seminar on challenges to and transformation of contemporary democracies. And I would like to begin by greeting and giving a very special word of thanks to Yves Mény, to our guest speaker, Professor of Political Science. For me, it's a personal honor, and it's also a memorable date for the ICS community. I think for several reasons. First and foremost, because you are with us. And so this is in the middle of the pandemic. It's a true honor to have you here with us in this room. And secondly, because you will be addressing a crucial issue for contemporary societies, the challenge to and the transformation of democracies. And I think that in the context of the pandemic, this is an additional and ever more fundamental issue. The pandemic is intensifying all the ideological tensions related to social categories and identities, related to inequalities, to the interpretation and meaning of democracy, say. And on the other hand, I think it's an overarching challenge for democratic societies, this reinforcement of boundaries, of frontiers, both symbolic and material. We have to contend with these increasing frontiers and boundaries to ideas, to democracy, to global solidarity as well across borders. And of course, thirdly, this is a memorable date because we are celebrating the publication in Portuguese of your memorable book in the Social Sciences Press. And so for us at ICS, this is a marker of your influence here at ICS on political science, on your presence, and I hope on the continued collaboration in the future. And I hope you will come back very often. For me personally, it's an honor to see you again. I don't know if you remember, we were on that difficult evaluation panel of the European Union, and Yves was a wonderful partner and colleague during those difficult moments and decisions that we had to take at ERC. So thank you very much, Yves. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you. And I hope everything, all the best for you in the future. So I wish you all a productive and inspiring meeting. I'm very sorry I will not be able to stay and listen, but I hope it will be a very productive meeting. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karin. Let me just briefly present the guest speaker. We'll have also with us at a later stage Henrique Monteiro, who apologizes. It was a bit late to arrive, but he will be with us at least in the last part of the seminar to also make a few comments on the book. He has reviewed the book for Espresso, and I was very pleased with the work that was presented to him, so he's happy to participate and say a few words at the end of this seminar. Let me just quickly introduce. I've very special. Maybe another mic.
I've turned it off.
No,
I've turned it off.
We have feedback. Maybe if it's a little bit lower, I'm trying to put as distant as possible. I have a special relationship with the guest speaker. Guest speaker was my PhD supervisor. I've worked with Yves Mény for many years as a student. He was in my panel when I first arrived at UI, and I probably made a complete mess of myself in that interview. But it did work. At the end, I managed to do my PhD there, and I had the chance to work with a person that has written so extensively on democracy and the implications of corruption to democracy. In fact, this was almost like a Bible to me. And so that's we go far back to the mid-90s when I arrived at ICS. But this is not about our long relationship. It's about the work and the trajectory of Yves Mény. He was former president of UI. When I arrived, he was starting. He had started already a few years as director of the Robert Schuman Center. And then precisely on the year we met, we still had a meeting at the Badia, but then you moved to the new building at San Domenico Convento. And from then onwards, the Robert Schuman Center, which is an advanced study center at UI, just grown massively. And there were projects at the time that were defining the future of Europe, like the simplification of the treaties, the Constitution of Europe. Everything was happening in that fantastic working environment with people from all over Europe and outside Europe. So I had the chance to witness that growth under the leadership of Yves. Actually, your background is you initially started from law and then you migrate to political science, which is it's a good way. It's a good way to go. Exactly, it's a good way to go. You've been sitting on several expert panels on research matters. Karin just mentioned the ERC, the expert group on foundations, research and development, the European Commission. Also being chairman of the European Consortium of Political Research, which is the reference network for political science in Europe. And as I said, you have massive publications on democracy, on populism. This is the Italian version of the book that has just been published with Imprensa de Ciências Sociais, and that is available. You can either buy it as ebook or on paper as you wish. If you buy it on paper, you might get a chance to get it signed today by the author. So a very special welcome, because it's also a very special context that you were able to come and visit us in presence, and despite that they canceled your return flight for today. They canceled it? Oh dear. We just postponed tomorrow. Postponed for tomorrow morning. This is also part of the context. I mean, it's so unreliable now. But thank you so much for being with us. This is also your house, as you know, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Does it work? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. First of all,
I think it's not on.
There we are. Thank you very much for your kind words, both of you. I feel a bit embarrassed by all this, but thinking a bit in a retrospective way, I realized that one of the key, let's say, experiences in my life was my postdoc at Cornell University. And I started to work on American populism. You know, at the time, American populism at the local level was something which was extremely exotic. There was no example of such populism institutionalized and not in Europe. But it was also a very rich experience about the functioning of university. What means a university? And I draw the lesson from this experience in the United States that nothing was unimportant. Everything has a value, from, let's say, well-kept gardens to the library, to the teaching, to the welfare of the students. And certainly that it has been, for me, extremely rich experience. I also realized that in spite of having studied very different topics, there is probably a red thread all along the road, which is indeed the issue of democracy in its various forms: decentralization, devolution, corruption, populism, institutions. It has been finally, I think, but I can tell it today with the benefit of looking at the past years, it was certainly not a project from the very beginning. Okay, so the paradoxical situation in a way today is that I will speak about the transformation of democracy, but I will start from the Greeks, because democracy, as I indicate, is a word, a concept, and we have only one word or one concept for realities which have transformed themselves over time and which are radically different from the initial paradigm. Actually, I would say that the dictionary, the grammar of democracy is Greek. And I would like to just mention a few words. The first one is a rather terrible one, is autochthony. That is, born from the earth. And erecte, which is the Greek god celebrated on the top of the hill, the erecteion, is represented as a person, as a being, half snake and half man. Why the snake? Because the snake is a creature which is the closest to earth. You know? And autochthony has become a key concept for the building up of political systems first and of democracy. And it's precisely one of the, let's say, key concepts which today are structuring the political debate. As Mr. Le Pen used to say, les Français de souche, the rooted French versus those who have not the fortune of having been born 600 years ago or 1,000 years ago in this territory. So autochthony is absolutely crucial, and it's of Athenian, not Greek, Athenian origin. The second concept, which is also quite important, not only in the name, but in its interpretation and understanding, is the deme, the demos. The deme is, let's say, the territory. There were about 70 or 80 demes in Athens, and they were the territorial basis for the organization of democracy. And from that time, democracy is rooted on territory. We could have rooted democracy in corporatist, let's say, systems organization? No, it's rooted in territory. But there was even a more genial invention, which was created in the 5th century, which was that the 17 or 80 demes were aggregated in 10 tribes. And these tribes were made of territories which were not identical. So they were the sea, the nearby the sea demes, the settlers, they were the countryside demes, and they were the city demes, in order not to create territories which could not speak to each other, which was an extremely interesting and fascinating political engineering of the time. Later on, they created the concept of isonomy, equality before the law. And it was not so much because the rich wanted to please the poor. Actually, they wanted to avoid a social revolution, which would have been the distribution of land to everybody. So in order to counteract the distribution, social revolution, well, the solution was, let's say, more limited, equality before the law. Citizenship. We live every day with the concept of citizenship. We have the same words in the Greeks, except that obviously the definition by the Greek was extremely elitist. There is a beautiful book by the American originally, but then British political scientist, historian about democracy in Athens, who said, well, after all, democracy in Athens was feasible and was possible because of slavery. That is, you had, let's say, perhaps 30,000 citizens out of a population of 350, 400,000 people. The others were foreigners, women, half of the population, and slaves. Most were slaves, which is an extremely interesting, let's say, concept of citizenship, because even today, we have not yet superseded this conception. Democracies, Western democracy, granted the right to vote to women in some countries after the First World War, in many countries after the Second World War, and in the new democracies even later. So the exclusion of women by the Greek, we should not forget that it was a revolutionary regime by contrast with the other political systems. But women were excluded, foreigners were excluded, and they are still excluded. That is, even people who have lived for 10, 15, 20, 40 years might be excluded from any political expression. And it's paradoxical, because we recognize to the foreigners in most of our system civic rights. They have the same rights than, let's say, any citizen. We recognize them extremely generous welfare rights, but we don't recognize the key, that is political rights. They are not entitled to vote. And in some countries, I mean, it has been, even for some natives, the exclusion has been a long-standing exclusion. For instance, native Indians in the United States were more or less fully integrated as citizens, at least on paper, only at the end of the 40s of this century. So it's very and I would add perhaps one concept which, for which we are extremely, which is extremely relevant both in Greek society and today. Aristotle says, well, we are different from the others, we, the Greeks, because we assemble, we talk, and we deliberate. Deliberation was, for him, the key difference in this democratic system vis-à-vis, let's say, empires or monarchies of the time. So, in many ways, the Greeks have provided us with all the tools and instruments of what democracy is about, except that each of these terms, each of these concepts has been transformed over time. That is, when we talk about democracy, citizenship, territory, autochthony, we have slightly different ideas. And so actually, the history of democracy after this extraordinary invention of the 5th century before Christ, the history of democracy resumes only, I would say, in the 19th century, while you have a few lights, such as the view by Rousseau about what democracy could be, etc. But actually, if you look at the three big revolutions, the British, the American, and the French revolutions, the ambition is not to create democracies, not at all. The ambition is to set up republics and representative government. But representative government is part and parcel of democracy today, but it's not conceived as democracy at this time. So there is an historical evolution which is quite interesting, because after all, the history of democracy is a very fresh history. Well, in Portugal, for instance, it's not a so old history, even if there were, obviously, in every political system, even the non-democratic systems, elements, bits and pieces, which could be used by democracy. And I would like at this point underline that what we call democracy today is what I call a bricolage. That is, we have created a kind of imaginative creature, which, like the mythological monsters, are made of components which are, in part, slightly contradictory. That is, you have contradiction, and I think the crisis, what we call today the crisis of democracy, is largely the consequence of the exacerbation of this internal contradiction. Just a word before exposing, let's say, the transformation of democracy. In 1999, it was just a matter of chance, I had to present a very short, make a very short presentation about the future of democracy. And I had as a discussant Bill Clinton, which was, it was in Florence, where there was a third way meeting. There was Tony Blair, Clinton, Jospin, Schroeder, etc. And Clinton was my discussant, which was quite exceptional. And I presented 5 proposals. And I said, well, but why not to try to take out these 5 proposals today in 2020 and see what has happened to this proposal, in what dimension may have they changed or not changed. So in many ways, the structure of today's presentation is based on the structure of 1999 presentation. But then, obviously, the developments and the comments are completely different, because we were not exactly in the same situation. In 1999, democracy was triumphant. It was a triumph of democracy. It seemed that there was no alternative to democracy. And today, as you know, we are not exactly exactly in the same situation. So perhaps I know it's I can
it's already on the second slide.
The great
revolutions.
Okay, now we can go the great transformations. Okay.
Backwards or forward?
No. It's forward.
Forward. Maybe I think with yours it's working.
And in addition, I am wondering if I've not provided the wrong PowerPoint because this was a
Great transformation.
Okay, great transformation. Okay, so we have observed during, let's say, the 20th century a few extraordinary transformations. The first was electoral franchise. It was let's say, the universalization of political rights. It has been quite slow, in particular in countries like Italy or France. It's only after the Second World War that, for instance, women got the right to vote. But probably one of the most lasting transformations of democracy has been after the Second World War, the creation and the development of welfare. And this is a good example of how democracy, as we know them today, are bricolage. The welfare systems have developed after the Second World War, and in particular from Great Britain and on the continent. But the first welfare measures were taken by Bismarck in the 1880s, building up some pension systems, contributions, etc. And you can't argue or pretend that Bismarck was a great Democrat. He was just a realistic politician. We knew that in order to avoid the revolution, you had to give a bit of resources, money to the poorer class. But he was a genius because obviously he created, for instance, a pension system in the mine or in the steel industry for those of more than 65 at a time where the life expectancy was 47 or 48. So it was not a too costly mechanism. It has become a costly mechanism. Then you had a second factor, which has been the decline of the nation state after the Second World War. That is, on one hand, the weakening of European states after the disaster. Secondly, the supremacy of the American umbrella, and certainly the building up of great empires. So, you know the thesis which has been developed by our colleague, British colleague, about the rescue of the nation state by the European institutions. You know? And but certainly that we have observed, and as we have observed a decline of the nation state, an increase of international, supranational organizations, starting with Europe, and a huge increase of multilateralism, which is today crumbling. Thirdly, and especially after 89, the indisputable supremacy and diversification of capitalism. But wait, capitalism is a big word for extremely heterogeneous economic systems. You know, there is not much to do between, let's say, the British capitalism and German capitalism. There are huge, also French capitalism, where the state is still quite important, less and less, but still important. So you have huge differences, and these differences may also have an impact on the formation and transformation of the democracy. There was also this period when I talked in 1999, there was still this belief that there was no alternative to democracy. That was a sweeping, let's say, diffusion of democratic values, and the West was extremely active from Jimmy Carter on in pushing, forcing democratic values and rights over other countries. The European Union itself was introducing conditionality in a lot of international agreements or documents. It was, suppose, also a period of end of ideologies. Fukuyama was stating the end of history. What an illusion. And internally, within the democracy, we have assisted to what we could call the allowing out of democracy, of politics, first because of the weakening of the political parties, the end of ideologies, to take a word by Peter Mayer, ruling the void. That is, the political parties, governments, etc., have still the illusion of governing, but actually power is elsewhere. For instance, in large multinational companies or in the European Union. So for all these reasons, democracies have been deeply transformed, but we have not probably fully realized the scope and the magnitude of this transformation before that the consequences of this transformation have become, let's say, apparent. There was a kind of underlying transformation year after year. Think, for instance, about something which was unthinkable in the 50s. The control by the Supreme Courts of legislation. That was, except in Germany and in Italy, for good reason, because of the previous authoritarian fascist Nazi regime, it was possible to create constitutional courts. Elsewhere, no. There were the exceptions. Today, there is practically no country among the existing democracies where you don't have either a Supreme Court, a High Court, a Constitutional Council, even the country which have rejected for the time being the creation of a Supreme Court, let's say like the Nordic countries, there are forms of legislative controls which are equivalent to the role of. So the supremacy of the law expression of the popular will has left room to a system according to which lawyers, supreme lawyers, at the end, are those who decide about the legitimacy or the legality of law. It's a sea change in our way of thinking. Okay, so the 5 propositions I expressed in 99 were the following, and the first one was the absence of alternative to the Western model has eliminated external threats, but enhanced internal challenges, question mark. Well, there was a question mark. And if I have to answer the question today, I would say that first of all, the absence of alternative has not eliminated external threats. We have more and more regional external threats, more and more. And there is no policeman, as the American policeman has more or less declared that he was on pension. So there is certainly the external threats are bigger in some ways. But what is more important is that the internal threats are today much stronger than they were in 2000. In 2000, there was the belief, indeed, that there was no alternative, that democracy was the best of the system, etc., etc. Today, you have difficulty in finding out in any country, let's say, the fact that there is a huge minority, which sometimes is close to a majority, arguing that they don't believe in democracy, that democracy is not a very good system, that it would be better to be governed by a Putin or by a Chinese leader, etc., etc. The number of people in Western democracies who do not believe anymore in democracy is impressive, impressive. In addition, you have new forms of governance, which transform the very idea of democracy, because these forms of governments are not, let's say, vertical as they used to be, you know, from people to elites and elites to power. These forms of governments are either vertical, but in the other way around, that is from the top to the bottom, or they are more and more horizontal and transnational. So actually, today, 20 years after this first talk, I would say that probably for democratic system as such, not for national power, but for democratic system, the risks are more internal than external. And when the bad examples come from the mothers of democracy, for instance, we can't say that the model we had traditionally in mind, that is the US or Britain, are today appealing models of democracy. The way the British Parliament has been treated by the British government, or the way the American president behaves today, are certainly far from the ideal types that we had in the past. Okay, the second proposition was to look at the link, the historical link between democracies and markets, and each of these two fundamental pillars, democracy on one hand, markets on the other hand, claim universality. And that was the thesis of the time, democracies are badly equipped to cope with major economic and social crises. True. But at the same time, with a few exceptions, I don't think the alternative models have proved to be much better. More efficient, probably. More efficient, probably. We have a huge problem of efficiency in democratic systems today. You know, when, like in Italy, it takes 20 years to build up the bridge, except if the bridge collapses, and in that case, we forget about all the rules, all the bureaucratic process, and the Italians demonstrate that they can build up the beautiful bridge in 2 years. Or when final decision by courts take 10, 15, 20 years and more, well, many people are frustrated by this bad functioning of democracies, and more people are dreaming of more efficient systems. But concerning this second proposition, it's important to underline with the Sen, the economists, the Indian economists, that there has always been pre-democratic forms in more or less in all civilizations. And to come back to Aristotle's view, deliberation. It was not democracy, but deliberation within council of all people or senior people, etc., were part of the system of government, even the most primitive. More important, it has been proved by the recent economic and political developments that democracy was not a necessary consequence of economic development. You have a political science literature of the 60s, which is extremely obsolete, because at the time there was this rather naive conviction that once a country has superseded a certain level of development, a certain level of national product, well, as a blessing, democracy was falling from the sky. Not true. And today, you have many countries, in particular in the developing world, who considers that far from being an instrument of development, democracy is an impediment to development, and the Chinese model presents itself. They are not making, let's say, advertising or publicity, but look at us. Look at what we have done in 25 or 30 years. It's indeed extremely impressive, and in some way frightening by some aspects. Such the development has been fast. But we should not also forget that China, the modern China, has been built up on a civilization which is one of the most refined and ancient forms of civilization of the world. So we have the proof today that economic development, contrary to what was believed before, is not related or not only related to democracy. So to come back to the question, are democracy badly equipped to cope with major economic and social crises? Difficult to really answer to that, because we are assisting to a new and radical approach to the economic consequences of the pandemic. Never as today, so much money has been thrown by all countries in order to avoid deflation, recession, social crisis, and political crisis. Never except at time of war. That is, you must have noticed that Britain has finished to pay back its debt of the Napoleonic Wars a few years ago. So they have been indebted for 2 centuries because of these Napoleonic Wars. So they made it. And probably the expectation or the hope of political leaders today is that this debt might either never be paid back or paid back through inflation. That's, it seems, the American strategy. The Fed has practically declared that inflation would be welcome. The European Central Bank would be in a more difficult situation since they have a constitutional target, around 2%. So they might afford 3, but if they go to 4, I think the German will start to be nervous. So actually, the way Western democracies are dealing with the pandemic crisis reminds us more of wartime than peacetime. Remember, last year, we were still struggling about the 3% deficit and the golden rule and the balanced budget, etc. Everything has disappeared. Okay, third proposition, the major phenomenon of contemporary democracy is its huge geographical expansion. The trend, what I was saying in '99, is toward universality as a model. Well, here I think I would have to change radically the sentence, because what we observe is an increasing rejection of democracy, not only within the democracies, but outside the democratic system. Democracy does not appear as a model anymore. Okay, in this, let's say, statement, I think my two comments were, first of all, that the varieties of capitalism have been underestimated. So democracies are also extremely variegated in their institution, in their forms, even if there are convergences among these. And history, past dependency, local traditions and cultures have also to be integrated in the evaluation of democracy. But what we observe today is the birth or development of what has been labeled as illiberal democracies. And I think we do not pay sufficient attention to a big problem of the democratic bricolage. The rule of law or the political rights are not by themselves democratic conquest. The rule of law, for instance, probably one of the most strange analysis or book on the rule of law was by Frederick II. I think it was in 1780 something, a few years before the French Revolution, where Frederick II, which was not especially a Democrat, was arguing in favor of Rechtsstaat. It was not so much that he was interested in democratic ruling. It was interested in a bureaucratic application of the rules everywhere and for everybody. So the rule of law was that, a good bureaucracy, fundamentally. Obviously, there were also similar developments, the rule of law in Great Britain, slightly less in France, but still, I mean, the rule cartel et mon bon plaisir was less and less acceptable, etc., etc. So the rule of law was something born out of the, let's say, of the legal systems more than from a democratic approach. The Bill of Rights were also a proclamation in order to protect oneself from power in Great Britain, then in France, or in the and then the amendments in the United States. But what is striking about the last, I would say, 30 years, is that if you consider that democracy are based upon a popular pillar, the people, and on rights pillar, rule of law, political rights. The popular pillar has remained exactly the same as it was, let's say, after the Second World War. We vote from time to time for political parties. We choose deputies, which form a government, etc., etc. There is not much change. While if you consider rights, let's say in 1950 and in 2020, so these are two different worlds. First, because the list of rights at all levels has considerably increased. Secondly, because the rights can be, let's say, protected by courts, which was not so much the case before. So the pillar, the rights pillar, has inflated. And I think everybody can be satisfied and happy with that. But what does it mean in political terms? It means that every time you proclaim rights, which are under the protection of courts, rights which cannot be modified, rights which cannot be challenged. It means that the field of politics has considerably reduced. I remember, this is a nice illustration, when the French government was confronted for the first time to the wearing of Islamic veils by women in France, the first reaction was to say, well, we have to ban it, to ban them. But after, let's say, a few days of reflection, the government said, ooh, the issue might be much more complex than we think. And they asked the Council of State to write a report on the issue. And after a few weeks or 2 or 3 months, the Council of State come back with a thick report listing all the French obligations vis-à-vis international treaties, vis-à-vis the European Union, vis-à-vis the court jurisprudence, vis-à-vis the Declaration of Human Rights, etc. Well, the path was becoming extremely narrow, and at the end, the result was the veil, the Islamic veil, is not, or it was even religious signs, in order not to stigmatize one religion, but religious signs can be prohibited at school. That's it. So it was not anymore an issue of wearing the veil at university, in the street, at home, etc. So it was completely transformed and reduced. And it's a fine example of how a political wish or ambition is reduced to very little because of legal obligations emanating from political rights. So today we have this phenomenon of illiberal democracy, but even if nobody can support the Polish or the Hungarian maneuvers, we have to ask ourselves up to where rights can be frozen, consolidated in such a way that then it's forbidden to change them, and by way of consequence, reduce the political field to the void. That is, why bother to vote for a party or another party, because anyway, they will have no room for maneuver. That's a big question. I have no real answer to that, because obviously everybody is happy when rights are protected by the law, by the court, and become untouchable. Okay, first proposition, the proposition was that democratic systems have radically changed, that's for sure, but that beliefs and institutions have not yet fully coped with this incremental but radical transformation. And the consequence of this, let's say, mismatch between the evolution of democracy on one hand and fixed institutional systems or fixed let's say, political principles, the consequence has been the outburst of populism, discontent, disenchantment with democratic systems, and the scapegoats have been naturally the elites, political elites, economic elites, banking elites, etc. And we are full in the middle of this challenge to elites, which appeared for the first time in the United States at the end of the 19th century. That is, the American populism came to the fore in the years 1880, 1890s, and it was a strong reaction to the huge transformation of American societies and the class struggle, if we can call it in that way, between extremely rich industrialists, the Rockefeller, the Vanderbilt, the Mellon, etc., which were huge fortunes, incredible fortunes, even by today's standards. And the rural population, which was affected by the liberalization of trade, and we could not face this first globalization. And let's say 2 or 3 years ago, I was still telling some of my students, we know that the first globalization ended in 1914. That was the end of the first big globalization. We are now in a process of globalization, which is at least as important or even more important than the first one. Is the road to globalization sustainable? How long will it last? What will be the stone on the road will make people fall on the road? I said, I don't know. Today, I could say, well, it might be that the pandemic would be the occasion. I don't think globalization will end, but it might be that some forms of globalization will be reduced, and it might be also that some forms of democratic submission to economic forces would be less acceptable. But in this new framework of transformation, there is another factor which strikes me. It's the falling apart of all mediating institutions. And this is facilitated first by the decline of the political system and the mediation political parties, which are empty shells today in most countries, but also many other organizations, and by a technological revolution that is internet, social networks, and what I call the Uberization of politics. You do not need anymore, even in your economic private life, you do not need mediation. You do not need the travel agent. You book your tickets yourself. You do not need a taxi company. You use Uber, etc., etc. But the worst of this transformation is that because of the combination of instantaneity, anonymity, everything can be said and disseminated on the networks. And I have to say that it's quite frightening, because the language of hatred, of racism, etc., which is propagated through the net is absolutely awful. Just one simple example, I think it was 1.5 years or 2 years ago, there was, let's say, damages and graffiti destruction in a Jewish cemetery in Alsace in France. And the following days, Macron went to pay tribute, etc., and condemn this action. And the visit was shown on TV, in direct on Channel 3, and it was possible for the internauts to react. After 10 or 15 minutes, the TV channel decided to cut off the reaction from the public, because most of the reaction were anti-Semitic, racist, etc. It was awful. So really, we have a new political instrument, which is in theory the dream for a kind of direct democracy, etc., but which actually shows in many instances, the worst of humankind. Okay, fifth and last proposition, and this is also a crucial problem. Democracy has been, from the Greek and afterwards, democracy has been a matter of national states. In the case of Greece, it was a matter of city-states. But democracy has always been conceived as a political system which can develop and can all, excuse me. What can you unblock it?
Sometimes it does
okay.
take a little bit.
Okay, you try to do it? And
I'll do it from position 5.
Yeah.
There it goes.
Democracy, historically speaking, has developed within, let's say, the Westphalian model. Every state, every nation state is able to develop as it wishes, dictatorship, authoritarian regime, democracy, etc., and is independent from the neighbors within the international community. And every state has the same, in theory, has the same weight, be it small or big, etc. This is the Westphalian model. The problem is that democracy has developed within that model. And we have intellectual and practical difficulties in conceiving of a democratic system which will not be exclusively national. Democracy is national. We have not yet found an alternative to that. We have found a few things, in particular at the EU level, but it's still extremely modest, extremely limited. And it's a real challenge because globalization weakens the nation state, but does not offer democratic instruments to overcome the fact that globalization has become an international governance, supranational governance have become so crucial. This week, there has been, let's say, a critical analysis of my book in a French journal, which is on the whole rather positive, but which concludes by saying, well, Mény has difficulty in foreseeing or envisaging alternative modes to representative democracy. I think it's not that I'm reluctant. It's that for the time being, alternative modes of democracy to the representative model have not yet proved that they can be satisfactorily substituted. In my view, they can be complementary. For instance, if you take the word which is extremely fashionable, participation, participatory budgets in localities, what do you observe? That everywhere, the percentage of populations which participates effectively is extremely thin, for very basic and simple reasons. First of all, there are peoples who are in favor of delegation. Delegation, if you trust somebody, delegation is much more comfortable. You delegate, and you don't need to be involved yourself, because yourself, you have a lot of things to do. You have a profession, you have a family, you might travel, etc. To be involved twice a week in meetings. The only country I know where I have observed a real participation actually is in the United States. Well, it's still a tiny percentage of the population, but so few people dare to vote. For instance, most of the referenda or most of the local elections, you have a participation which goes from 3% to 20%. Very low participation, very in the elections. So for those who wish to be involved, participation is a sense of deliberating, pushing for, etc., might be a good, rather good alternative. But in European systems where participation in election are still around, let's say, 40, 50, 60, 70, depending on the countries and elections, well, the actual participation as it exists today is extremely low by any standard. Another form of involvement could be direct democracy. And we have a good example, Switzerland. They have still voted last week on quite a hot issue. They have voted in favor, by a small margin, in favor of buying planes, military planes. They have voted against a proposal to limit the circulation of foreigners, which is not banned by I think 60–70%. So the Swiss are used to vote regularly on some proposals. It's part of the, and it works. So it's an interesting addition. You have also some forms for building up consensus. For instance, in Ireland, a country which was highly polarized around the issue of abortion, before the referendum, which was not supposed to be binding, but at least indicative for the parliament, before that, there has been a process of deliberation through groups, but it was disseminated. So I'm not reluctant to this form of, to these additional forms of democracy, but it's probably impossible to substitute these forms of democracy, even the most radical one, that is direct democracy. It's not possible because you cannot govern in mass every day on every topic. Impossible. You know, people are fed up, etc. So I would stop here because I've probably been too long. I have not looked at my watch. But what is interesting in the democratic developments is that indeed the bad news is that democracy is in crisis. But the good news is that democracy are always been in crisis. That is, it's a continuous process of adaptation, transformation, rather pragmatic by picking up bits and pieces. For instance, we consider in Europe that welfare is part and parcel of what a democracy should be. In the United States, as you know, this is a very challenging proposition. Welfare is for the very poor or for the very old. For the rest, take care about yourself. So we can see how the definition of democracy varies over time, but also over space.
Thank you. We already have with us Henrique Monteiro. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You know that, I mean, Henrique is, I think people in the room are probably more familiar with your face, but obviously you need to show your face.
I can notice that you.
And Henrique has been following these transformations in Portugal since ever. I mean, since democracy was born, but I would say as a professional.
Yes. Since you were born.
Yeah. So probably as a journalist, I mean, at least since the late 70s for sure, and it's been interviewing and following all the legislative changes, constitutional changes that Portugal went through in the last decades. And so I invited him also because he contributed with a review of your book, which I thought was very insightful and touching the key elements of the book, which I had the pleasure to read, and I recommend. It's a very good read indeed. I think we did a good job with the translation also, because sometimes we lose a bit of the context and the translation.
And I
but I
have
think it's
no way of controlling the translation.
Trust me.
Trust you, yeah.
And I think so. I want also to thank the translator for the good job. Henrique, if you could share with us a few thoughts on these transformations and challenges to democracy, probably relating a little bit more to our case.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Luis. Thank you, Professor Yves Mény. On peut parler en français.
No. But,
we continue in English.
Or you can, or English or Portuguese, even pick up just.
Okay, now I will speak in English. Well, I'm sorry I was late, and I was writing down to Expresso for tomorrow's edition when Luis calls me and told me, well, where are you? I'm at home, I'm writing. So, but it begins right now. And so I thought it was at 6 o'clock. So I was thinking about this kind of contradiction we have now with the pandemic between the freedom, like in Madrid right now, between the freedom where a court says that they cannot have exception measures because it's again the fundamental rights and fundamental freedoms, and the pandemic itself, that all of we are using masks and everybody stays away from the other. Our society is unsociable right now, and I was thinking about it, and I was finding the sharp and correct response for this equation, but then I forgot it because I must to come to this wonderful conference of you. So I just let it as a asking mark, and I cannot answer that, as I think nobody can answer a lot of questions you make on the book and right now in this conference. Look, you say something that impact me very strongly, and it is the worst threat to democracy. It's perhaps the lack of alternatives to the lack of alternatives to democracy. Mm-hmm. So I can take
yes, please. It's easier.
Eu sou cada vez mais surdo.
Ok. Tu és o Manel. É o Manel Vila Verde. Olá. Já tinha desconfiado. So back to English. Times ago, in all the fight for democracy in the world was opposed by people that was in favor to, I don't know, communism or fascism or absolutism or monarchism or something concrete something right that someone could be in favor or not. But now democracy is threatened by people that we don't know who are there, because they are in social media with alias and anonymous names. They are just against power, against elites, against everything that are the pillars of some society, democratic society or not, and they want nothing at all. They just want to destroy.
Talking about the Gilets jaunes?
Oui. Yes, I mean.
because
well, it's
against everything, but nothing to propose.
yes, and you write it before the Gilets jaunes, we must say, and this is I think is the beginning of the conversation, because we have to think about this. Like Professor said, democracy is in crisis, but all the time it has been in crisis, and deep crisis, because democracy is something that are construct every day and every year, every moment, and we don't have answers for everything. We thought it's true that the markets will bring democracy by itself. Well, if you have some freedom of market, some freedom of buy and sell, some freedom of exchanges, naturally we would have freedom of choice, of freedom of voting, of freedom of meeting, of freedom, all the fundamental freedoms. But nowadays you can see that is not quite so. Even in Europe, in Hungary or Poland or other countries, or even in the United States, in some parts of the United States, and mainly in China or Russia, is totally wrong, that kind of thinking. So the market and democracy are enemies or allies, as your question put it. Well, I don't know. I would like to think that they are more allies than enemies. But right now, we don't know. And I think we don't know because, in some part, it's our fault. Because look at the 90s, when all the liberalization of the commerce were made in the world, we didn't ask anything in change for the Chinese put all the products in Europe or in the United States. We don't ask for some human reivindication, some human in very simple things like, I don't know, you cannot work more than, I say, 10 hours per day, which for us it's incredible, but for them it's not. You have to have 10 days of holidays or 15 days of holidays. You cannot have children with less than 16 years working. Well, there's something, you have to have 1 day per week of
free time.
Yeah, free time. So there's simple things that for us are appease older than all of us, but we didn't ask for that. So what we made, I think, it's that we made an equivalent or an equivalence between the market and any regime, any sort of power you can have in the world. And I think it's the origin of the evil. It's more or less by those times. And now you have, as I said, the pandemic or pandemic or something. I can't pronounce it in English because I've never been in a pandemic before this time. That I'm staying in Portugal since March. And we have all that. And we don't know how to answer that kind of questions. It's very impressive, the money we are spending with this compared with what we spend with the wars. But the wars as a need to reconstruct after the war. And with that kind of COVID, we don't have any need but saving lives. And the result will be less people than we have right now. I think there are two totally different ways of exit of the crisis. And I know which is better. Of course, it's better not to have war, but we know that war have some consequences. They are very interesting for the development of the world. I think it's very interesting in your words and in your book, the need of reconciliation between democracy and transnationalization or internationalization or globalization or mondialization or what mondialization is worldization or something like that. Because I remember that Jean-Claude Juncker, which is not supposed to not to be European, said we cannot have nothing against the nations. We cannot construct Europe against the nations. I think he's right. And I think he's right. Everybody. I'm not a nationalist, and I'm not a patriot in the common sense of this world. I'm an Europeist. I want to be universalist and all of that. But I understand very well that the space of democracy can be a limited space, or a lot of limited space that have democracy among them. Mm-hmm. Cannot be just like we think, oh, okay, the United Nations will have a government, because it's impossible, and you see it in Europe. In Europe, it's impossible to a Portuguese to think that you will have some importance is vote in Brussels or in Strasbourg or in Berlin or in Paris or wherever. So why this is important? Because that kind of tension between democracy and transnationalization, it's, as you say, the origin of the modern populism. And the modern populism from right or from left. Because in that kind of way of thinking, they are connected. They don't like to face a world that is all world like one, or something like the globalization. Left and right, the far left and the far right, of course, and mainly the populists in left and right are against that. And that just underlines the lack of coherence in the speeches and in the practice, in the wills and in the results. And so what we have is a kind of, I used to say that in Portugal, it's true, you say, we have our governments are more and more like our autonomical regional governments. They can always argue that all the good are done by them and all the evil is done by Europe. And as a matter of fact, they do that if you look at the news. And that is the principle, it's one of the principles of populism. It's not a group, it's not a rassemblement, it's not yes, it's
a gathering. Or...
A gathering, yes. It's not a gathering of wills and of politics, but it's a permanent fight between local and global. And our leaders, I think in Portugal, I think in all about in every country, more or less, of Europe. I don't know if some countries are totally different. By instance, Belgium, that should be completely different because it's the siege of Europe, and all the European institutions, more or less, are there. They are more nationalists than the most part of the countries. So I think in every country, we have a huge political system and political government to blame, and the local government that normally appears in front of us with this, lots of paternalism and lots of willings to doing well and cannot be otherwise because Europe doesn't allow it. And that's the way we have right now. So if you don't have a political system and the political theory and the political action to end up with this this contradiction between what is transnational and local, I think it's very, very difficult to sweep away the populism for our political speech. Well, I don't know. It's the kind of reflections that Professor Yves Mény brings to me. I don't know if I will answer your question.
No, that's a good point of departure, and I'll kick off with now to the public. I mean, there's students around that would like to pose some questions. We already have some of them right away. One of our students from Brazil is asking whether there is any study about the impact of the COVID crisis, or any crisis for that matter, on democracy. I mean, we had economic crisis, and certainly there is literature on that. So this one is quite sui generis.
No, I don't think there is yet anything. There are obviously a few papers in the press, but nothing yet substantial. I would like just to precise that I've not myself studied the impact of COVID on democracy, but I am presently working on, let's say, the modernity of Greek myth. And there is in the Iliad, there is a narrative about, let's say, the Greek army, which is disoriented, which is desperate, because there is a pest, a plague pandemic. And what is interesting is when you look at the reaction, etc., more or less you have the same reaction than today, that is fear, attempts to interpret the reasons why, in that time, the gods, today, how the Chinese are, what's his name?
The World Health Organization.
So, yes, or the former Google.
Microsoft.
Bill Gates?
Bill Gates.
Yes, Bill Gates.
Yeah.
Bill Gates is one of the targets, etc.
Yeah.
So you
Because
have,
of the last.
And
you have more or less,
George Soros as well.
the same structure of reaction. Obviously, reaction vis-à-vis those who govern, etc. So it would be extremely interesting to look at it, but we need more time. You have some people who say, well, it will be difficult, but in 2 years' time, the good time will come back as usual. planes will fly, people will travel, etc., etc. Personally, I'm not so much convinced that some substantial changes will not occur. First of all, because already the view of the future, the view of society by the people is changing. There are some changes. So the view of the world might be different. The hierarchy between values might be different, but we need time. It's time to collect data. It's time to observe. It's not yet time to conclude. We are just in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah. One of the impacts, I'll pass. I've seen the people asking for, so I'll pass the word. One of the impacts we're now studying, for instance, was the way the COVID pandemic has restricted the functioning of local governments. So municipal assemblies had to go online. That immediately in rural areas excludes a lot of people, that a lot of representatives who are not familiar with the technology, so with low levels of digital literacy, and obviously scrutiny of the executive, especially at the time when the executive is taking extraordinary measures and cutting corners to get to the outcomes, that it becomes a little bit more worried that the local deliberative body is not exercising the accountability which is needed. I've seen one arm raised there. Anyone else for questions? Two?
No, okay. And as we start, I thank you for the opportunity to be
Exactly.
here.
Could you just say your name and probably a bit loud? We don't have a microphone to go around, but now I don't think there's a chance of having one microphone for everybody to go around.
My name is Sousa. Let me just start by three previously disclaimers. I'm a historian. I did political science and IR. I lived 10 years in Budapest, and I recently transitioned to create some companies in the blockchain and tech area. And I think it will be important to some of the comments I want to do here. Let me first start by challenge a bit of Henrique Monteiro's, for instance, introduction or comments. I actually think there are alternatives to democracy. I live in a country that every day presents an alternative to democracy. They claim it as a liberal democracy. And they try to have a political, if you like, spreaded movement that tries to be transnational to a certain extent, failed miserably, I think, to the benefit of Europe on the last European elections. They try every day to feed on the American example, especially now. And as I think most of you are informed, try to co-opt Bannon's approach to Europe, and they try to confederate a common platform on the last European election. That's right. But they are still very much alive in Hungary today. And I think COVID, for instance, is a wet dream for some of these dictators in power. And they are spreading, and they are still keeping much more alive, their political grip and their political project. And they are presenting themselves as an alternative for the liberal democracy still today and inside the European space. So this will be like my first comment, because this is much more alive, and this is still in a debate about the future in Europe, where we are still deciding how we're going to do and how we're going to deal with the current pandemic crisis. So this will be my first comment. The second comment is about how I are using some of the same concepts as we are utilizing today. So trans-globalization or transnationalization, as you want to frame it, how is this going to be on post-COVID? Because, for instance, are we going back to the 80s and the 90s, when this means, a privilege for some elites? As I remember going to Brussels, going to see in the plane prime ministers, MEPs, business. Or are we talking about the post-Erasmus, generation, when this means access, to a variety of opportunities for thousands and hundreds of thousands of citizens that started slowly to build up a new identity of what is to become a European citizen, where their grounds, on how they are, behaving and where they are grounded, started to become multiplied by their places of origin, of birth, of universities, of work, so on and so forth. Because I think this is going to be challenging in the near future. So I don't think that the same mindset and use of concepts that we are thinking when you're using the same terms are going to be replicated. This is my second comment. The second one, and actually I was waiting all your presentation for you to get your proposition on it. Because up until then, you're talking about classic proposition 4, your classic institution definitions of power, correct? Until you talk about technology, right? You're talking about what is called, you know, like the big four or the big five, essentially Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft. Their role in politics, their role in how to define power lies, how behave. And in this sense, I don't know, because I have to go out so I don't know if you mentioned an intervention in politics and political debate. Because part of your presentation, you were trying to reduce our activity to the ballot. But that activity as citizens is actually daily. And the proof of that is the fact that we do have a president of the United States that daily reacts to the likes and dislikes or to the memes that social media feeds him, or he thinks that it feeds him, and he acts on the behavior that this multiple of people, existing or non-existent, is telling him to act on policy or perceived policy. Yes, actually make it clear. This is the first question. The second question, of course, we're talking about the body of entities that have absolutely no scrutiny. And I don't know if you followed the recent hearings that these 4 companies had on the Senate, not the Senate, sorry, on the Congress. This was 2 months ago. I watched 4 of the 5 hours, and they were grilled, literally grilled. And if actually it was something that reminded, since I'm also, and I think this is a reference that you find that the antitrust laws by Teddy Roosevelt, when they were challenging exactly, you know, like the effects on the first, you know, like wave of the antitrust and the first waves that you mentioned also in your presentation. And if you take the word of mouth of the Congress, these companies will be dismantled in the next 5 years. Now, I bet that they will not be, for different reasons. But, you know, like, I want to finish because I want to give the floor also to others, because I want to feel it with a cynical question to you as well. Because you mentioned the 1999 seminar that you had, you know, like in the beautiful Convento that Luis so vividly described.
Downtown, actually. I think.
Sorry?
I think it was downtown, no?
Yes. It was in the Palace of Power, La Signoria.
Because if I am taking the description to the word, right, you were talking about the third wave, right? And we were, of course, you know, the shoulder, you know, like Blair, you know, like we call the top players. And I'm crossing this with your last expression. Democracy has always been in crisis. I mean, this is the good. And it always finds the instruments to come out from the crisis, as it did after the First World War, the set of treaties, as it did after the Second World War, with problems on both sides of the curtain. We simplified this. But it did have, from the national and international, you know, like platforms, the necessary instruments to resolve their own situations, either by constitutional reform, international treaties, so on and so forth. So for the crisis we are witnessing today, who will you invite and who will you talk for the next conference to solve this issue? Who will be the CEOs that you will invite and who you will have this conversation with?
Well, I was invited. I was not the one who. But I remember in the comments by Clinton made a very interesting comment, because I quoted Machiavelli. That was a place to quote Machiavelli. And Machiavelli, in his Prince, stated that it was extremely difficult to reform. So the difficulty to reform is not a new issue. But I just say that. And Clinton took the ball in very efficient fashion and said, yes, you have quoted Machiavelli, but you have not quoted the sentence fully, because Machiavelli states that it's difficult to reform. Why? Because those who will have to suffer from change know perfectly well the cost of change. those who will benefit from change have no precise idea about the benefits they can, which can derive for change. So those who are against aggregate very easily, those who might benefit have not a clear perception of the benefits of change, and they do not mobilize in favor of change, which also shows that Machiavelli was a bright mind and he had already perceived these kind of things. Well, I have to say that personally, I believe that one of the major challenges, not even of the future, of today, is how to deal with social networks and the GAFA companies, you know, because first of all, there is a kind of massive intrusion in our lives, which seems impersonal. But if I buy a book on Amazon, then I am flooded with publicity by Amazon about, oh, well, you might be interested in these books too. So they have analyzed my taste in matter of books, and they are, but if I book an hotel in Lisbon, I would be flooded with publicity about, why don't you go to Madeira, or why don't you go to Berlin, etc., for your next holidays? So we are permanently under observation, analysis by this. So already from the viewpoint of privacy,
There is a solution for that. There is a solution for that.
I just finished because the second problem is anonymity. The anonymous possibility of to hide himself behind a name, and I think this is absolutely the denegation of what democracy is about, because in a democracy you deliberate, but you deliberate with people which can be identified, who positions themselves on one issue, while and it's a vehicle for hatred, for everything. And I think as long as anonymity will, it favors, let's say, delation. I mean, I think, for instance, the Me Too campaign was certainly a legitimate campaign on behalf of women, but how many accusations have been made using the possibility of denouncing, etc. So this is, all democracies might be jeopardized by these powerful companies and the massive data that they can exploit. And you know, it was already an old story. You remember the Red Army faction in Germany in the 70s. How were they identified at the end? They were identified because the German police noticed that the terrorists were using, let's say, were renting apartments of a certain type. For instance, apartments where the landlord was paying the electricity bill on behalf of the tenants. So by treating millions of data, already in the 70s, they were able to trace the terrorists. Today, I mean, it's a matter of, you know, there was an assassination of a prefect in Corsica. They were able to identify those who killed him just by analyzing the phone data, you know, and the signals transmitted without even no need to speak, just the signals which for instance indicate that today I'm in Lisbon, and if there is an inquiry about me, it will be extremely easy to discover that I was in Lisbon on the 9th of
And where in Lisbon?
Okay, so that's for me is but these big companies are not only exploiting data. These big companies are transnational. I remember I was struck about 15 years ago in a visit in China, in a university, that there was a technological park, and that all the GAFA companies were there, exploiting, let's say, the resources of China manpower and also researchers. So these companies are typical example of what we call international governance. But it's a government which is invisible, which is not accountable, and that's the reason why we have to, first of all, perhaps to break up these companies as the antitrust did in the past for the banks, but it also means that the courts, European courts, American courts, start to be more demanding on, but I don't know if they will succeed. Huh? Okay, then you had a question about illiberalism. No, your second question was?
It was more of a comment, if you like.
Yeah.
The alternative to
about populism and illiberalism, I'm convinced that we go the American way. That is, populism has existed in the US from the late 19th century. Trump is the first populist government in American history, but populism never died. Populism was extremely active at the local and state level. The revolution, the surprise, is the election of Trump, and which radically changed the system, because the state and local system in America was very populist at the local level, but the constitutional federal government was really something else. It was checks and balances, it was controlled by the courts, it was selection of candidates by parties, etc. And the revolution in America is precisely that populism has taken over from the grassroots to the top. So it's time for perhaps coming back to a more traditional set of institutions. There was also another question.
We have two actually from participants at home. One, whether we should look at other popular experiences emerging through contemporary insurrection as alternatives to liberal democracy. I mean, sort of revolutionary, small cases. I mean, mentions the Zapatista revolution in Chiapas, and I'm sorry, I don't have the glasses with me. Federalism in Kurdistan.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question, if I may, is about how it. Well, I'll do that. I'll try to read the other one.
Yeah. Okay.
In the meantime.
Well, revolutions are revolutions. That is, they might happen from time to time. The revolution is not a permanent state of affairs, because if you do the revolution every day, I mean, you go usually nowhere. The case of Venezuela is rather typical of these. There is in 1945 a beautiful speech by De Gaulle about revolution, dictatorship, etc., and where he states that a revolution or a dictatorship is always in need of accelerating the speed, because every day you have to feed the machine with more and more and more, up to the explosion of the machinery or the exhaustion of the machinery. So, I mean, revolutions might be unavoidable when the situation of people, as it happens in many countries, is really unbearable. But again, revolution has to end, because a revolution, it's a revolution, but it has to have an end in order to stabilize society. It might be in one form of regime or one another. I do not pretend that a representative democracy is perfect. But the problem is, as Churchill stated, it's extremely difficult to find out alternatives. And for instance, the populist, if you look at a beautiful case of populism in action in Italy, it is ending in ridicule. I mean, the Cinque Stelle pretended that they would do nothing without the approval of the activists, which could click on the platform called Rousseau, etc. Well, the Cinque Stelle 2 years ago, 2 years and a half ago, were chosen by 11 million people. First political party in Italy, 11 million people. Okay, they said, we should ask our activists if we should ally with others. At that point, there were 40,000 people voting. So a group of elected people with the support of 11 million people was then asking for authorization, and the authorization was voted by 40,000. Then there was the case of the alliance between Cinque Stelle and PD, and they asked again to the people, please give us authorization to do that. 16,000 voters. So you see, the so-called alternative to representative governments are not that convincing, because indeed people had considered, okay, we have voted for the Cinque Stelle, we have done what we wanted to get rid of the old politicians, we wanted to support them, and then it's over.
And besides, the platform of Rousseau is full of tricks.
Yes.
And they is owned by two brothers, I think, that
and it's absolutely non-transparent.
Yes, absolutely. And all the tentatives to account the platform by the journalists, for instance, are completely denied by Cinque Stelle.
Yes,
it's very interesting as a party.
And the second question?
If you don't mind, I'll take this, the two from the audience, and then the other question, perhaps it would be the last one, is what kind of ideas you have to strengthen representative democracy to overcome what you call the Uberization of politics. So if we could have your final thoughts on that, but perhaps just collect these two questions from our students.
Well, it would be, I think, a long process, because I've mentioned the word Uberization, but we could also say we are observing what we could call an Americanization of party politics. That is, parties in the United States do not exist. You could argue that there are 100 parties, that is twice 50 Republican or Democratic parties. There is no, like in Europe, by the way, there is no federal party. You have an electoral machine, and this electoral machine becomes more and more dysfunctional, because at the end, for instance, we can observe the result. On one hand, you have Trump, and well, good consequences. On the other hand, they have been unable to find out another candidate than Biden, which is certainly a respectable person, but who is more or less my age, I think, which is not probably the best age for running a large country like the United States. So the first thing to do is to try to rebuild some mediatory institutions, including the political party, but it will take a lot of time. And in order for the political parties to rebuild themselves, they have also to be credible. That is, political parties should stop to say, when they are in opposition, everything that the government is doing is wrong and do the same when they are in power. They lose complete credibility because there is a contradiction between their speech and their action. And when it's minor things, well, it can be forgiven and forgotten. But when it's on major issue, when an opposition party says we should not spend money on military weapons, and then they buy the most modern weapons available on the market, it's a full contradiction. We are against Europe. And then, okay, no, we can't change the rules of the game, so we accept Europe. This kind of speech is absolutely detrimental to the credibility of political parties. But I'm afraid that no mediation is a disaster in a system of representation, because if you are represented, you need to fuel the system, to feed the system with trust, which is probably the value which is the less available.
Can I just take these two questions from our students from first year?
Please. Yes, my name is Gabriel. I'm a student of the first year of PhD here from Brazil. And my question is about the relationship between voters, citizens, and elected leaders in modern democracy. I think that's a subject that if I understood well, it was a little bit implied in your presentation. It appears to me that the leaders nowadays has less power, much less power than they used to have in the past.
Of course.
Because of lots of constraints, international constraints, internal constraints from the people from the rights, courts, etc. And some leaders, I think, face this challenge in a democratic way, like, for example, maybe Angela Merkel saying to their voters, this thing I can do, this thing I cannot do, and this thing I have to negotiate with the European Union or the United Nations. And some leaders like Donald Trump and other populists prefer the populist way. I can do everything, I'm a good person, but they are a bad person in the United Nations and other places. But my question is, what is, in your opinion, what do leaders should do to face this challenge, to deliver their promises in a context with lots of constraints? It's a challenge of communication, to say clearly things to their voters. It's a challenge of negotiation, to negotiate better with all the institutions, external and internal, or it's a lost battle. The politicians nowadays would never deliver the promises because they have too much constraints.
It's a difficult question because obviously there is a push in favor of leadership in modern democratic system everywhere. With variations, for instance, there is a strong leadership by Merkel, but you could not argue that Merkel is a charismatic leader. She's not, but she delivers, etc. So the parliamentary systems, from this point of view, might have a slight advantage because there is less push in favor of leadership and more in favor of collegiality. It's a mix, because we should remember that in the famous Weberian trilogy about, tradition, about legal legitimacy, political legitimacy, and charismatic legitimacy, actually Weber is creating ideal types, but these ideal types are never realized, and he tries to figure out what is the right balance. And populism push for more leadership, because the leadership is the embodiment of the people. And the people is a very ambiguous concept. There is a marvelous definition by a French philosopher of what is the people. It's stated, the people is the part who wish to be the whole. And I think this is really perfect because everybody pretends to be the people, the entire people, which is absolutely impossible. The people as such is a fiction, an abstract fiction.
Yeah.
You have majority, you have people in the streets, peoples in the streets, you have that, but the people as such does not exist except in our minds. Okay, there is no sociological reality of the people. So there is a push in favor of leadership by populists. There is a push in favor of leadership because of the communication, new instruments of communication. But there is a limit to that, which is the risk of authoritarian regimes first, and also the risk that you have underlined, that is the incapacity of the leader to deliver and the overload of expectations on the leader. Some leaders sometimes say, but I'm not Father Christmas, or I'm not God, or I'm not, etc., because indeed they can't deliver. There are a lot of constraints and a lot also of unexpected events which change radically. So again, it will always be a matter of balance and equilibrium or not. We can't expect or hope to have a stable system except for a few years, for a few periods. And for the rest, I'm convinced that, as I said, we have to live with a bit of populism, whatever will be the system, especially because of these new technological instruments which favor protest, to be against, to disseminate its own ideas and views, which is probably the first time in history which exists, because the only thing which reminds me of this capacity of expression was in 1718, 1709, the famous Cahiers de doléances by the peasants in France, and which was extremely detailed, and expressing the views of the people with, let's say, the priest or somebody a bit more educated collecting all the views. It was probably the first time that an entire population, village by village, could express its views and claims. But otherwise, I don't believe in a stable situation in the near future, especially these days. The last question?
Would it be possible, the last question, please, if you don't mind?
I'm Louis. I'm a student here, the PhD. My question is about...
It's easier for us to understand.
So my question is about this idea of democracy in crisis. And especially what I find interesting in all the parties is that everyone claims to be a Democrat, right? For the far right, democracy means the right of the people to decide whether or not they want more immigrants, which terrifies the left and liberals. For the left, democracy means people deciding whether or not they want more welfare, but not whether or not they want more immigrants. And for liberals, democracy means respecting rights regardless of what the people want. And for the German central bank, democracy means electing people who fulfill European rules. So how useful is this concept even? We know what democracy is not. China is not a democracy, right? But how useful is it when everyone pretends to be the people, says he's a Democrat, and the second thing I wanted to say is that I appreciate very much you starting your story with ancient Greece, and that is my second question, which is that Athens had to deal with the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the power of Sparta, and Philip of Macedon, we have to deal with internet bots, internet trolls, and what, Mark Zuckerberg. Are we that in danger as a regime?
We have a thing for a new Eliad.
I think I will come back to the beginning of my presentation and the quotation of reference to Aristotle. First of all, the supremacy of democracy is deliberation, which means that each of us, for instance, has a view about what is democratic or not. Each of us has a view about how much welfare we should distribute or not. Each of us has an idea about, let's say, how much rights we should have or increase. But deliberation and respectful deliberation should be the occasion to find a middle way between these various views. The problem is that the place for deliberation were first political parties with some bias, but they were deliberating within the party, then between parties, then within the parliament. We can forget about it because there is very much, very little deliberation. And what has substituted deliberation is, again, internet, but there is no deliberation. You have parallel discourses, and people, if they discuss or deliberate, they discuss and deliberate first between them. So you have subgroups, which are more or less chapels, and when there are people deliberating between opposed views, it's not deliberation, it's just insult.
Yes.
I'm always terrified when I happen to read these expressions on social networks. I think that people can just insulting each other.
Yes.
Yes.
Fortunately, yes.
I can say that.
So, and I have no answer to that, except that I don't know if it's possible or not, but I would fight to death against anonymity. Because if I want to insert you, I have to take responsibility myself for doing it, not to be under the pink elephant. No? Yes. No.
Just say, sorry, just this is going to be the second. I had that note when I did the disclaimer, actually. I'm actually working on blockchain and these technologies. This is a solution for some of the questions that you were posing. Like these sensors, like this dilemma of surveillance capitalists and government, the users of this technology. The next web, the 3.0, it's working on a decentralized web versus the centralized web that we're talking about. This is a road for the future, where people can have their own SSI, self-sovereign identity. This is where we're going to lead forward. So I think that the future is going to have the solutions for some of the problems that you are having.
Well, let's cross our fingers.
Well, we end up with this positive.
Can I just say one thing to that?
Yes, please.
Sorry, I didn't fix your name.
Luis.
It's Luis also. Yeah. Well, I think the problem is not everybody claims to be democratic, because the right or the far right says to be a democrat is to choose where the immigrants can enter or not in our country, or the left saying that it's whether or not you can have more or less welfare or minimum wage or something like that. I think the problem nowadays is that there is a radicalization, and each part pretend or wants to impose their concept of democracy
in the name of the people.
In the name of the people, the abstraction that professors have, the part that wants to be the whole. Yes, it's just that, because I think that it's the main question in our times. After all that professor and all the people says today here, is that we have a radicalization in our societies that destroy completely the concept of common ground in which is based democracy. And I think, sorry. Thank you.
Just, thanking Yves Mény for being with us in this first session of the doctoral program, and to be in presence in such a special context. Thanks again to Henrique also to participate in this discussion. I would like to say for students that this seminar is coordinated by my colleague Susana Salgado, who couldn't be with us today, but she will eventually coordinate the forthcoming sessions. So don't worry, you are in better hands than mine. Just say that this was, I think, a very exciting way of kicking off the seminars of postgraduate studies. We still have a lot of interrogations in our minds about the topics. This reminds me of a passage on reflection of the 40 years of political science in Europe, when we were having this discussion between us, and I remember, I mean, what's left for us political scientists? Because as it stands, we have citizens that don't trust politicians. We have citizens that dislike or don't understand the process by which they are governed, and certainly they dislike a lot of the institutions that were put in place to represent them and to secure this day-to-day collective running of society. So it is. I mean, all these interrogations that you've brought to us and that they are addressed in more detail in the book are real challenges that we face in years to come, and there's still a lot of reflection that we'll have to make, including about the role that the technology will provide and the alternatives that technology will provide to some of these transformations. Thank you very much for your presence and for staying with us for these 2 hours, and we hope to see you in the next seminar. Thank you.
Merci pour le compte rendu que vous avez fait de mon livre. Oh non, c'était très bien pour moi parce que je suis d'accord sur 90 en 99. Et c'est chaque fois plus difficile de rencontrer